I actually forgot clean about it. On the 9th of Adar was my grandfather's Yahrzeit. Uh, and yeah, he passed away in 1986. I remember it was in Purim when I was at Menorah Primary, Yeshiva College. And the next day they were celebrating Purim at the school. The actual school was closed, but it was officially a few days before the real Purim. They used to do it as chinuch at the school. So I just wanted to share my screen and just tell you a few minutes about him. Just give me a second before we start. Gemara share and Kevin teaches us. So that was my grand on the left and my grandfather on the right. And although he passed away when I was quite young, from what I understood, he lost his eye, and I'm not quite sure where. I remember we went shooting because I used to have like a mushroom or a air rifle sort of thing, and he could see out of the one eye. I'm not quite sure what happened, but I know that he escaped on a boat, and he had an operatic voice, and it was shot down in the Atlantic Ocean, and something about surviving on a potato vat or something like that. So I don't know what he went through. They never did speak about what they went through. You know, they didn't really want to traumatize the kids. And he used to keep sweets and cold drinks in his pockets. And when I was young, I always thought it was unusual. But my dad said, you know, try going around without food and drinks, and you develop a certain need to keep these sort of things in your pockets for the grandchildren and for you. You know, so we don't know what sort of pressure that generation was under, both financially as well as during the war and post-war. And he didn't really talk about it, but I just knew him as he was just warm and gregarious, loved cooking, loved the family, and I miss him. He loved the racetrack. He actually passed away at the racetrack. Um, he won a lot of money on a horse and he had a heart attack. No kidding. All right. So I'm pleased we're doing the Mishnah because Mishnah and Neshama have the same letter before we do the Gemara. So Kevin, just for a minute or two, share a good idea with us with Brim. I'm sure my grandfather Harry
So
shared it.
in this week's Parshat Tzav, now I've got two short ideas. I'll be very brief.
Sure.
Parshat Tzav talks about kashrut and kashering vessels. And if, generally speaking, if heat is applied to a vessel, then the food usually absorbs into the body of that vessel, and it has to be purged. If you want to kasher that, let's say, bowl or dish, you have to use heat to remove it, and then clean it, wait 24 hours. Then it's a whole process. But you can actually use a dish after, let's say, it's been used for meat. If you wait 24 hours, let's say, it can't be considered food anymore. What's ever been absorbed into that as a last resort, what's it? Lechatchila. But ever, Damon.
Well,
You can use
after the fact, yeah.
You can use a vessel, even if it was cooked for meat. If you wait 24 hours, 24 hours later, you can actually eat. I mean, obviously, one shouldn't do this unless one really doesn't have any other vessels. Because after 24 hours, it's not considered food anymore. It's disintegrated and it's, what's the word? It's not considered food anymore. So one can do that. But in terms of kashering, you have to apply heat to remove the taste. And another thing is that Damon actually asked me if I was in Jerusalem. So you see there's a wall behind me, but that's not the Western Wall. It's the Ramat Gan Wall. So
Yeah, facing the
in
west.
terms of Jerusalem, now this is very interesting. Now, Jerusalem, had I been in Jerusalem today, let's say I would have had to fulfill all the mitzvot of Purim again, because in Jerusalem, Purim was actually last night and today. And if you happen to be in Jerusalem, then you have to do the Megillah twice. If you have, let's say you were in Tel Aviv on Saturday night and you heard the Megillah and you heard it on Sunday and you had a meal, did all the mitzvot, but you decided to go Saturday, late Sunday afternoon to Jerusalem yesterday. You would have to listen to the Megillah again, and you decide to sleep. And then in the morning and evening in the morning, and do all the mitzvot and the Suda again. So that's why some people don't do that. So that's why I didn't go to Jerusalem. So just keep that in mind. If you're ever here for Purim, stay in one place, and only unless you want
What's
to
the
do
reason
Purim
for that?
twice.
Sorry
Some
to
people would
interrupt.
like doing it.
What's the reason for Jerusalem doing it twice?
Because Jerusalem's a walled city. Jerusalem, thank you for, I should just thank you. Jerusalem is considered a walled city, and walled cities, I think there's Akkar, there's one or two others where the Purim was actually last night. It's on Shushan Purim. And one thing about Shushan Purim, Damon and Gavin.
Section. Just giving a share.
Damon?
But it's in the meat. But it's in the meat section. I'm saying.
And Arthur, listen to this.
Pull it from the meat drawer. Yes, but I'm saying if it's in the meat, if I pull it from the meat drawer, I'm expecting meat. But thank you. All right,
so Purim was today's actually Shushan Purim. So one very neat thing you need to do on Shushan Purim, and regardless if you're in Jerusalem or in Tel Aviv or anywhere, you need to shine your shoes because it's Shushan Purim.
Yeah, Shushan Purim. That's correct. I want to ask you something. Does that only impact Purim, or does it impact some of the other holidays?
No, only Purim. It's very so.
Why only Purim?
Because I know some people. No, that's because it's a walled city. Walled city is on Shushan Purim, on the day after Purim in walled cities, which was last night and today.
So they celebrated 2 days in any walled city, even in Israel.
No, the only day it started last night, not Saturday night.
Oh, it starts a day later.
Yeah, the day later.
Oh, so still 1 day.
Some people. I was at a Shabbos lunch in Tel Aviv, and the people from Jerusalem hosted it. They stayed until today, till late afternoon. They didn't go back to Jerusalem because they wanted to Purim only once. Some people like doing it twice, but they came for a long weekend, and they did Purim Saturday night, Sunday.
It is what it is. So the Mishnah discusses a person who stole a field from his fellow. It continues where the previous Mishnah left off. If a river is inundated, the stolen field, and destroyed it, what we're saying is that in agricultural societies, you had water estuaries built by the river so that they would irrigate the various fields for grain, etc., and fruits and crops. And therefore, sometimes the river banks would collapse, or the estuaries would soak the soil to the extent that there was very little oxygen, and it was quite a heavy viscosity and didn't allow for much flourishing and growth. So if this river was inundated and the robber seized the property, how did we say seized it? There were two methods. He either moves the boundary markers as a next door neighbor over a period of time in incremental steps, or he basically became a squatter with some of his friends and henchmen, where the owner of the field couldn't force him off the land. At this point, the robber is going to bail because the property is of no good to him either. So he says to the owner of the field, listen, behold, what is yours is before you. Meaning, whether or not I had arrived on this property or not, the river would have taken its natural course of events and flooded the field. The fact that I can be ejected from the land and I can't sell your fixed land as movable property is proof that I don't own it. I'm merely occupying it for a time, and therefore what is yours is before you. So that's to say, it's not liable to pay for the ruined field, for land cannot actually be stolen. Even if the thief takes it, it remains in the owner's possession, since the land remains his own. The original owner incurs the cost of a natural disaster. We also said that that did preclude payment that the robber would have to pay for any damage his hands actually caused to the property by digging on the property of that which he was occupying, or if he sustained any benefit by enjoying the crops or the fruits that property yielded, that field yielded. But we are saying that that's not really a case of robbery. That's a case of a damages action. So whether or not you bash your car through your neighbor's wall, whether you occupying the property from the inside and you're bashing it by reversing out, or you from the street and you bash somebody's wall, either way you're responsible for damages. If you take the benefits of your neighbor's property, is entitled to compensation. So this is irrespective of the robbery aspect. Now, the Gemara goes into a Tanaic dispute, and it's using a brisa we learn that says if one steals a field from his fellow and a river inundated it, the robber is obligated to provide the owner with another field. These are the words of Rav Eliezer. So that means that this brisa is directly contradicting our current Mishnah in Bava Kamma. Now, the rabbis hold by our Mishnah and said that if the robber says to the owner of the field, behold, what is yours is before you, it means that he doesn't actually own any land that he happens to steal, because on a practical level, it cannot be. Okay? Whereas Rav Eliezer is saying, look, he can occupy it in the sense that when we say that the field comes into his possession, we don't mean that he can keep the field and not pay for it. What he's saying is that Rav Eliezer is saying because there is occupancy against a person's will or through moving boundary markers, at that point, the thief is absolutely responsible for any damage that occurs to the property. And as Kevin quite rightly said, this Rav Eliezer is more on the side of the homeowner or the field owner as opposed to the robber. Whereas the sages say, listen, on a practical level, you can't steal land. You can't walk away with it. So that's the basis of their two opinions. Now we want to see in what points do they disagree. And we're saying that they have to be basing it either on logic or scripture or both. So what pasuk do they use for their proofs? In Leviticus, Vayikra, chapter 5, verse 21 to 24, it says, if a person sins and commits a treachery against Hashem, and he lies to his fellow regarding a deposit, or a loan, or a stolen article, or he defrauds his fellow, or he found a lost object and denies it, and he swore falsely about any of the things that a person can do and sin thereby, and it shall be when he repents, having sinned and became guilty, he shall return the stolen article that he stole, or the proceeds of his fraud, or the deposit that was left with him, or the lost object that he found, or regarding anything about which he had sworn falsely, he shall repay its principal and add its fifth to it. He shall give it to the owner on the day he admits his guilt. So there are phrases there that speak in general terms, and there, Kevin, are you falling asleep? Okay, so there are phrases there that speak in general terms, and there are phrases that speak in specific terms. And then it ends off with phrases spoken again in general terms. So again, pasuk, general, then it goes specific, and then it goes general. Rav Eliezer is saying it goes with the amplification, which means to include everything. It then goes specific, Kevin, and then it goes to another amplification. So we are saying, what's the difference between the process, the human nautical principle of general to specific to general, klal, prat, klal, or you can use a different methodology, and you could turn and use the term let me put it like this. Amplification, limitation, amplification. Okay, so in that particular case, we have the riboy, which is the general statement, and then we have mi'ut, which is the restrictive statement, and then we have again riboy in the pasuk, which is a general statement. So let me just tell you what the difference is between the both of them in terms of a one-line sort of principle. When you go general to specific, you take everything that's included in general, vague, expressive, expounded terms, and you make it specifically honed in to one thing at the exclusion of the general. Okay? And therefore, when you add another generalization after that, you can only expand the specification from one example to maybe another 2 or 3 examples within the same mindset as the specification, Kevin, within that same mindset. So, in other words, for dreaded disease cover, you would say, life assurance covers us for diseases, and the specification has the disease cancer. And then the general statement says other dreaded diseases such as strokes, diabetes, cardiovascular, pulmonary, etc., etc. But it's still within the specification lined up, even though it's got more general as opposed to one item. But it's still super, super restrictive. When you go for amplification limitation, amplification is a total inclusion, and then the limitation, Kevin, what does that do? It limits it only 1 degree less. Only 1 degree less. So it's still pretty general. So when you do an amplification at the end of the limitation, after the first amplification, so you've got amplification in the pasuk, according to Rav Eliezer, limitation, which just gives it 1 notch below. The amplification again almost makes it as general as the first one. So why, in fact, would you have the limitation? Well, for one reason is that the only thing that you're excluding with a limitation is something most dissimilar from the limitation. Something most dissimilar. So again, amplification, it includes everything. The limitation just brings it down 1 notch. It's not like the generalization specification where it goes only to that item, just takes it down 1 degree. And when you go again for an amplification, it includes everything except something most dissimilar to the limitation. So we can see that when you go amplification, limitation, amplification, it's far more inclusive than when you go generalization, specification, generalization. Which is why you can see offhand that Rav Eliezer would include land, because an amplification, limitation, amplification means you're including a whole lot of other items, Gavin. But when you go generalization, specification, generalization, the last generalization is almost the same as the specification. It just lists 1 or 2 very, very similar items in the same line of thought with the specification. So it's much more constrictive and therefore would exclude land in terms of what you can steal. Does that make sense? I'm taking away all the detail. Okay, let me show you how the Gemara plays out. Okay, and then we can always go for more specificity. In what point does Rav Eliezer and disagree with the sages is that he expounds scripture in the method of amplifications and limitations. He applies this to the scriptural passage that teaches the obligation to return a stolen object. And when the pasuk states, and he lies to his fellow regarding a deposit or a loan, for example, that is an amplification of the class of items that can be acquired through stealing. In other words, if you can lie about it, you can steal it, pretty much. So it's as amplified as you want to get. If you can steal it, you can lie about it. Not that you're allowed to, but in other words, if you transgress by stealing, you can lie about stealing. So that allows a whole lot of things, almost everything. So by generalizing, guys, the verse tells us that anything at all, even land, can be acquired through an act of theft. Okay? Because there's a superfluous sort of statement, and he lies to his fellows, an independent clause. That's looking as a generalization technique. Then the verse is going to hone in a little bit from that amplification to a limitation, and it says, listen, regarding a deposit or loan, and therefore that is saying already it limits the class of items. So I'm mentioning that the verse tells us that not everything can be acquired through stealing. Then the verse states, or anything about which he swears falsely, again amplifies it, because you can steal almost anything and lie about almost anything, and therefore it amplifies the limitation of the items that can be acquired by theft. So you say, well, then what was the point of the limitation? Because the rule is that where the Torah amplifies, limits, and then amplifies again, it means to include everything in the relevant law with only a single exception, guys. Again, according to Rav Eliezer, who's going through the amplification, limitation, amplification, it is set to include everything in the general amplification, except it's limited with a single exception, but not as limited as when there was a limitation before a secondary amplification. So, what then did the Torah include with its amplification in the passage, in the second amplification? It included all things according to Rav Eliezer, even land, in the laws concerning the return of a stolen object. All stolen things have to be returned according to Rav Eliezer, because there's a biblical commandment to do so. And therefore, if that article is damaged that was stolen, it has to be replaced if they can't be returned. Okay? So, perforce, they can be acquired through stealing. And what's the one thing that the Torah excludes through its limitation according to Rav Eliezer? Well, if you looked at this term limitation, it was talking about like deposits, loans, etc. So what's the concept that it wants to exclude? So according to Rav Eliezer, it excludes documents. So why are documents the least similar things to the items mentioned in the verse? I'll tell you why. So again, the limitation excludes only a single thing. When it goes back to the amplification category, it includes everything except something the most dissimilar to the limitation. What is that? It excludes documentation. Why? All right, we've learned this before, if you remember, because all the items mentioned in the pasuk, remember there were money, there were vessels, there was a donkey, an ox, etc. They were either what? They were. It was either items or money. And what does these things have? Intrinsic worth. Debt documents, by contrast, have no intrinsic worth. So you might say, hang on a second. It does have intrinsic worth. All legal documents have intrinsic worth. And we are saying, Kevin, no, it doesn't. Let me explain to you what the concept is of documents. It's the whole point of documents, like debt documents, according to Rashi, is that although they have no intrinsic worth, they're scraps of paper, basically. The obligation that they entail is what they record. In other words, what they record in terms of concept has value, but they don't embody that value. They merely serve as proof of it. Do you get what I'm saying? In other words, that paper, Kevin, is worthless. If you have a thief that steals other items from your money, that's worth money. If he steals a random blank piece of paper, that's not going to have anything worth, even it's worth less than a pruta of value to you. What is the value? There's no intrinsic value. The only value that paper has, as far as that's concerned, is a concept, because it records and serves as proof of the arrangement between you and a fellow party. It's only if that document was made of a very expensive parchment does that paper have intrinsic value. So if a person steals somebody else's debt document and damages or destroys it, it's regarded as having been destroyed while in the possession of the owner. And obviously, if the document is intact and the thief has it, he's got to return it to the owner, because there's a halachic biblical obligation to return stolen objects. So as far as that's concerned, Rav Eliezer says it excludes documents which are the least similar to the items mentioned in the verse. So you might say, well, money too doesn't have any intrinsic value. But money does. Kevin, you're falling asleep. Your eyes are closing. Okay? And money does have value, Gavin. Let me tell you why. Because if everybody in a country of 50 million people acknowledge that they're prepared to exchange labor or other items in return for that money, there is what you call objective value by a group of millions of people that have attested value to that particular item. If it is your personal debt document where somebody says that they owe you money and it's signed by witnesses, it only has value to you. And that paper doesn't have value. The information of what it contains has value because it serves as proof of a contract. So therefore, if debt documents are stolen, Rav Eliezer doesn't hold liability. Okay?
So,
But he does for land because he says land has value. Let me finish, Kev. So according to Rav Eliezer, the verse teaches that stolen land is included in the obligation to return stolen objects by biblical law, which means that with the act of theft, the robber acquires the land, meaning he acquires the obligations that if the land is damaged while in the robber's possession, he is liable to pay, as if he stole any other object. He has to return it. If it's damaged and he can't return it, he's responsible. Now, we're just going to go through what this rabbis hold. The rabbis use a different methodology of humaneutical principles to derive that pasuk in Vayikra, Leviticus chapter 5, verse 21 to 24. And they say they're expounding the methodology of generalization, specifications, generalizations. Now, we already said if you're doing that, it's much more stringent than amplification, limitation, amplification. So again, Kevin, the words "and he lies to his fellow" are his generalization, because whatever you can steal, you can lie about. That's pretty much anything. And the words regarding a deposit or loan are specification, because now we're already talking about items that have value. And the specification clarifies the meaning of the generalization that precedes it. In other words, it's not just any object that you can lie about or any object that you can steal. It has to be similar to a deposit or a loan. Okay? So then when you're saying you're lying to the fellow, it's a particular class of stealing mentioned in that next specific phrase, a deposit or a loan. So then again, the verse states regarding anything about which he swears falsely. So when you say regarding anything about which he swears falsely, the Torah has again generalized. So then you say, well, what's the need for the specification? So again, the rule is that when you have a generalization, a specification, and a generalization, you can expound the overall law to include only those things that are similar to the specification. Okay? So just as in the case specified in the verse of a deposit or loan, certain things have to have that similarity. Even when you go general, what is that? What does a deposit, a loan, an ox, and all these things have in common? Two things. They have value, intrinsic value, and they're movable. They are movable and they have intrinsic value. You can put money in your pocket. You can move a cow from point A to B. So the entire class of items that can be stolen, according to the rabbis, have to be movable and have intrinsic value. So what do you think that excludes, guys? According to the rabbis, land. It excludes land because it's not movable. Also, according to the rabbis, by the way, it excludes eveds, slaves. Why? Because for legal purposes, they're analogous to land. Do you remember in Vayikra chapter 25, verse 46, concerning Goyish slaves, it says you can bequeath them to your children after you as a holding to possess. Meaning, just like you can bequeath real property and land, you can bequeath slaves. And what does that mean? Is that they can't go towards paying of your debts. Whereas movable property, Kevin, can be attached for creditors to pay debts, whereas fixed property goes to orphans. You remember that? So slaves you can bequeath them and they're not attached for debts. Okay, so again, what's excluded from theft that don't resemble deposits, loans, oxen, etc.? It's land, because there's no transportability. Even though they have intrinsic value, they have to have the two factors. They have to be movable assets and they have to have intrinsic value. So both land as well as slaves are seen as property in that they are not attached for debts by creditors. They go to the heirs or the orphans. And for all legal purposes, it also excludes debt documents. For the same reason that Rav Eliezer did, is that there's no intrinsic value in debt documents. So although they're movable, unlike land, paper doesn't have value. What the information has in the paper in terms of proving to serve evidence for a certain contract, the concept has value, but not the piece of paper. Okay, so I hope I've explained that well enough. I just want to finish the Gemara before we go through details. Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, sure.
You said that documents have no intrinsic value, but it has value to the person that owns that document, and let's say a title deed. But if someone steals that title deed, let's say the name, and then let's say the name's not on it, then it is of value.
I know what Kevin's trying to say. Kevin's saying, well, surely if you've got the title deed, your property is now yours.
Yeah, so
it's now yours, except it's difficult because it said Kevin Mayerthal brought this property from Damon Kabb. How are you going to prove you Kevin Mayerthal if you gave it forward?
Yeah, so I wanted to just say that as long as we're all on the same page with this, Gavin.
So let me just finish the
and
James,
hold on. Also, the other thing, if you look at Bitcoin, it didn't exist, and suddenly it's got value because a whole lot of people got together.
That's
and said
exactly
it's got value.
So what is perceptionary value becomes actual value. That's exactly right. But it has to be accepted by the general populace, or certainly enough to create an economic viability of its perceived value to give it market-related worth. Exactly. So lands are not included according to the sages because they're not movable. Okay. Slaves are termed as land because you can bequeath them to your heirs even if you're in debt. Okay. As far as debt documents are concerned, it doesn't have any intrinsic value, unlike cows or money or assets that are movable or cash, because it serves just to record the concept of what is valuable, but that paper doesn't have intrinsic value. So, according to the sages, the verse that Pasuk teaches that stolen land is not included in the obligation to return stolen objects, because you can never put land in your pocket and walk away with it. You may occupy land and force yourself upon it, but you can be evicted, and therefore you're not responsible for natural causes of damage to the land unless you yourself damage the land, at which if you damage somebody's land, even if you never stole it, you have to make restitution. So it means that the act of stealing land does not cause the robber to acquire it and therefore be responsible for replacing it. So if the land is damaged while in his possession, he's not liable. Okay, let me just finish off with something here. So there's a potential difficulty with this interpretation. And regarding that which has been taught in the Brisa, this is going to throw us off until you understand how it's interpreted. If one steals a cow and the river swept it away, he's got to provide the owner with another cow. These are the words of Rav Eliezer. But the sages say the robber says to the owner of the cow, behold, what is yours is before you. Meaning, if I return a dead cow that's drowned, you got your cow. So it seems as though the point in which Rav Eliezer and the sages disagree might not look like what we've said. In other words, in the case of this price, the stolen object, being a cow, was movable and has intrinsic value. Still, Rav Eliezer and the sages disagree precisely as they did regarding the stolen field. It would seem maybe that their disagreement is in fact not based on a differing method of expounding the above verse. Why are we saying that, Kevin? Because if Rav Eliezer says that if you steal a cow, you have to replace it even if it drowns, and the sages say no, then it can't be because the specification had to deal with movable and intrinsic values. Otherwise, the sages would say that you are responsible for returning a cow that you stole if it wasn't alive anymore. So the Gemara is saying maybe that wasn't the dispute. And the relief that you should have now, Gavin, is that in fact it does fall in line with what we say. How do we know? Rav Papa said, what are we dealing with over there? With the case where he stole a field and there was a cow lying in it, and a river swept the cow away. So what happens is the thief performed no special act of acquisition on the cow itself. Accordingly, whether he acquired the cow is directly dependent on whether he acquired the field. Why? Because we learned this concept of, with a cow, if you want to take possession of movables, you have to have mashicha, which is an act of acquisition of pulling. Because there wasn't an act on the cow, how did you get the cow? Well, if the thief stole the land according to Rav Eliezer, and he's acknowledged as that land being his, the cow is actually acquired along with the field. It means because it's a kinyan agav, which means acquisition by dint of. When you own the land, the movables that are on the land you've got. Okay, so that would answer Rav Eliezer's question. And Rav Eliezer follows his reasoning expressed in the previous brisa that a thief acquires the land he steals. And when he acquires the land, he acquires the cow along with any movable along with the land. Therefore, if the cow is damaged and drowned, just as the field is, since he owns the land and the cow, he has to replace it. But the rabbis follow their own reasoning, expounded in the previous brisa, that a thief does never acquire the land he steals. And guys, if you can't acquire the land, you don't acquire the movables on that land by kinyan agav. Therefore, he's not liable for damage sustained by the cow or the land. He just simply has to let the owner take back what nature did to it. Okay, I'm done.
That's really good.
I'll be very brief, Damon. Then I'll be brief. Thank you, Shker. So, this week's Parsha Tzav, discusses the various offerings and when people certain offerings can only be eaten in the state of tahor, purity. And if the person is not in a state of purity, it could be they could be liable for karet. They could be cut off, which sounds a bit weird. I mean, for partaking or eating something that someone would have to be in a state of purity, but I think this only applied during temple times. And secondly, short point here, certain fats and bloods can't be eaten. It says here actually towards the end of the parsha, fat is called chelev, and it's interesting that chelev and the word protein, chelbon, are very similar. Chet, lamed, bet, and it comes from the same root. So what it says here, when it says you can't eat the fats and the bloods, you can't eat the fat or consume the fat or the blood from animals that are, where is it here? That are eligible for offerings. So like bulls, goats, and all the animals that we learn about, you cannot get benefit, consume, which is actually eating sheep, goats, and cattle. But you can for animals such as deers and gazelles. Well, in Africa, that would be
Gazelles are very dear to me.
easier. Gazelles, okay.
Very
Gavin,
dear.
didn't you have a pet gazelle once, or a deer many years ago when you were growing up?
He named it
Yeah,
Amanda.
but I dated a goat coach just